All right, hey guys, it's your really freaking tired teacher. Dude, I'm just counting down the days for EOC and AP. Like, really, I'm so done. Okay, yeah, let's go ahead and talk today about the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s because we only got a couple of days to EOC and you're gonna learn. Okay, plain and simple. We got just a couple of days to cover really 4 decades because EOC goes up to the 2000s to President Obama. So, yeah, this is gonna be fun. Good thing is that we covered a good chunk of the 70s with Nixon last time. So this is going to be Ford and Carter and the start of Reagan for this lecture for today. So sit back and yeah, let's learn some history. So let's go ahead and cover this late overview, crash course style. Okay. So leaving, okay, where we left off was Nixon resigning because of Watergate and Gerald Ford becoming president. So, Gerald Ford becomes our 38th president, August 9th, 1974. Remember, he replaced Spiro Agnew, who was the vice president at the time, because he got convicted of tax evasion. So he resigned and was facing probation, I want to say. So Gerald Ford is picked to step in as vice president, and then Watergate happened. Well, Watergate, I think, was already in full swing when he became vice president. But then, yeah, Nixon resigned because he saw the writing on the wall, and he would have been impeached and convicted had he stayed. So, yeah, this is how Gerald Ford kind of became the accidental president. So, what Ford does, first off, is pardon Nixon. Yeah, that happened. And people were not happy about it. That really was a bad mark on his presidency. So, for domestic policy, that's pretty much about it with Ford. Like, honestly, we're going to do a weird thing here where we're going to cover like a lot of domestic policy first for the 70s, and then we're going to cover foreign policy. So, yeah, this is Ford's domestic policy. That's about it. All right. So let's jump into the next election where Jimmy Carter is going to win. He wins a narrow victory, however, against Gerald Ford. So Jimmy Carter is a Democrat, and this guy's like one of the nicest guys ever to become president, and he's such a humanitarian. But his presidency was plagued by a lot of gridlock, by economic woes because of the embargo that we talked about last time, the oil embargo. So, I mean, he also has stagflation to deal with. And seriously, this is happening again? What the heck, man? Oh, this time it's Mr. Vasquez. What is going on? Seriously, I'm recording a video, and this is the second freaking time in as many days that I get interrupted with a phone call from one of my colleagues. Lord, dude, it's this time of year. But anyways, let's talk more about Jimmy Carter. So, Jimmy Carter his presidency is plagued by the oil embargo, the economic woes that come from it, like stagflation and whatnot. So, yeah, his presidency is going to be plagued by that. But again, he's a humanitarian. He promotes human rights. A lot of his presidency's successes, though, come from his foreign policy. So we're going to talk about his foreign policy in a couple of slides. But let's go ahead and talk about what happens with a Supreme Court case, the University of California versus Bakke, which is about affirmative action. So let's go back to President Johnson. So President Johnson had issued Executive Order 11/24/6, yeah, which requires federal contractors to take affirmative action to ensure that applicants are employed, that employees are treated during employment without regards to race, creed, color, or national origin. So Later, it's going to involve women as well. And it kind of like strengthens the Civil Rights Act of 64. Remember, they got rid of discrimination in large part through that act as well. So really what affirmative action is aimed to do is to correct like past wrongs when it came to discriminating against people, well, concerning race or ethnicity. So affirmative action is going to lead to racial quotas, where places are going to start to seek out minority applicants, whether it be education or, businesses and such, and require that a certain number of employees or students meet those guidelines. Like, let's say the threshold is 10%, then they have to have like 10% of African Americans. Just an example. So with this case right here with the University of California, Alan Bakke is a white man who has rejected admission to the University of California Medical School at Davis twice. And the school had to reserve 16 spots for qualified minorities as part of like their effort to go ahead and meet those quotas and combat, the unfair past minority exclusions that they had done, or that had been done towards minorities. So Bakke's GPA and test scores were higher than some of the minority students that were admitted at the time of his application. So he's going to claim that he was excluded from admission solely on the basis of race because he's a white man and those spots were reserved to African Americans. So this case is about whether or not UC Davis violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause and the Civil Rights Act of 64. So, because, by implementing affirmative action, they had rejected Bakke's application for medical school. So what the court says is that there's no single majority opinion on this, really, because even the court themselves disagreed on the status of racial quotas. What the ruling did do, however, is allowed race to be used as one of the many criteria for admitting students. But they do side with Bakke in the sense that, the quotas had violated these equal protection clauses of the 14th Amendment, but they don't totally strike down using race as a factor for admission. So the Supreme Court will go back and forth with this issue like crazy. One of the more recent ones was against the University of Michigan. Another one was against the University of Texas. Dude, they've been going back and forth with affirmative action, like for real. Happens a lot. Okay, let's talk more about Carter. So, economic woes, inflation, which rather stagflation that occurs. And you could see it hits its peak like during Ford. But he's still reeling with the economic effects of it while he steps into his presidency. Because, the damage has already been done to the economy. Jobs have been lost. We have like outsourcing by some of our industry by this time. It's bad news here in the United States. And another thing that happens is the 3 Mile Island disaster. This is a nuclear reactor near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. It experienced major nuclear power, an accident that occurred in March of 1979. Cooling valve failed to open. The radioactive core overheated and released clouds of radioactive steam into the atmosphere. So this freaked everybody the hell out about about nuclear power. So you're going to have like lots of protests against nuclear power saying, we don't want this to happen. Chernobyl hasn't happened yet. So 3 Mile Island so far is like the big, nuclear disaster that we've had. Chernobyl, of course, happened in the Soviet Union and the Ukraine, but that happens in the 80s, and we will talk about that under Reagan's presidency. So let's hit on to foreign policy. Now, with the Apollo 13, this would be, this is the mission that was supposed to go to the moon. The Apollo 11 was a successful one. And I want to say Apollo 12 was as well. So Apollo 13, we try to repeat history with this. But this one ends up being like the successful disaster in a way because the Apollo 13 members faced like so many problems on their mission. And so there's like so many malfunctions going on with the ship and whatnot. And it's a miracle that these guys landed back on Earth alive. Okay? So that's why it's the successful disaster, in a way. There's a movie about it. You guys could watch it. Okay, foreign policy with Ford. More foreign policy with Ford. Henry Kissinger is his Secretary of State. He carries over from Nixon. And, of course, a lot of Nixon's policies are going to carry over. So, Ford continues with detente. And he meets with Brezhnev in Helsinki. And what they do is hammer out more of the SALT I treaty. Okay, we kind of hinted on that with Ford. So, well, rather he's going to continue SALT I into SALT II. That's really what happened. So let's go ahead and talk more about it. So at the meetings, that occur between both nations, they agreed to work on another nuclear warhead limiting agreement, which is SALT II. So again, continuing SALT I under Nixon. And they also agreed to accept post-World War II borders in Europe. So again, like with the whole Germany thing and the Iron Curtain and all that. So all of that's like hammered out. The Soviet Union is pledging to improve its human rights record as a result. So, steps in the positive direction, I assume. But at this time, yeah, nukes are kind of dangerous. Like, they've always been dangerous, but they're even more dangerous at this time. Because, we've got ICBMs, we've got ABMs. We have crazy nukes at this time. So the MIRV warheads are really crazy. They're called multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles. So they have the capability of breaking into several hydrogen bomb warheads that could hit several targets. So once they're launched, each one of those warheads could go to different spots. That's crazy. So we're kind of feeling this whole mutually assured destruction. Like, if we were to launch a nuke by accident and the Soviet Union does the same, we're basically both goners. Like, it's the end of the world as we know it. All right? So, yeah, if either side starts up a nuclear missile and aims it at each other, it's a mutually assured destruction for sure. So, since we know that it would be the end of the world as we know it, that acts as a deterrence for both the Soviet Union and the United States as far as launching all-out nuclear war. So, keeping things going out of fear. All right. South Vietnam falls to communist forces right around the time of Watergate, I want to say. Or rather, I think Nixon already withdrew by this point. Well, already resigned by this point. But yeah, continuation of what happened in Vietnam. We withdrew our forces, ended the war over there. South Vietnamese fell anyways, communist forces. And Laos and Cambodia joined up as well, and they became communist countries in the same year. So, dude, domino theory, we totally lost on that one. For real. So, moving on. Let's go ahead and talk more about foreign policy, but this time under Carter. So, here's some foreign policy issues that Jimmy Carter is going to face. His most famous one, however, is going to be the Camp David Accords and the Iran hostage crisis. So, we're going to focus mostly on those two, but let's go ahead and talk about relations in Latin America. So, one of Jimmy Carter's first human rights gesture was to give the Panama Canal zone back to Panama. Remember, we had controlled it since 1914. So Jimmy Carter is going to be like, you know what? Yeah, Panama should benefit from the canal going through their region instead of us. So Panama had been pretty resentful about the original canal agreement growing in the 60s and 70s. So they were resentful because of the amount of time that the United States would control it, who would benefit monetarily, because yes, you have to pay a toll to go through the Panama Canal, and about the rights of the United States to expand the canal facilities. So Jimmy Carter's going to work out an agreement with Panama, and there's 2 treaties that are signed. So the U.S. agrees to turn over the Panama Canal on December 31st, 1999, and the treaty is going to protect the U.S. interest in the canal because, I mean, come on, they're helping with the upkeep and stuff, and also increases Panama's economic benefits to the canal that goes through their territory. So we're kind of trying to set things right now. As far as with the Soviet Union, though, Jimmy Carter tries to continue détente. He really does. But it fails because the Soviet Union continues to support the revolutions in Africa. And since Jimmy Carter is a humanitarian, I mean, this kind of goes against his mission. So the Soviet Union had deployed medium-range nuclear missiles in Europe, and they forced the U.S. to respond. So Carter and Brezhnev are going to sit down with the SALT II Treaty again, and they limit the number of nuclear missile launchers and other nuclear delivery systems. The Senate, however, refused to ratify this part of the treaty. So why that happens? Because Senator Jackson here is saying that, oh, it's going to improve relations with the USSR without the improvement to their human rights record because of their involvement in Africa. So, I mean, it's kind of like on moral grounds that he refuses to help to ratify the treaty in the Senate. So, you know, relations kind of dwindle because of that. And to make matters worse, in 1979, the Soviets occupied Afghanistan. And relations between, you know, 2 superpowers again is going to start to chill once more. And the Cold War is going to carry on. So our optimism concerning détente, you know, suffers greatly. But one big success foreign policy-wise for Jimmy Carter is going to be the Camp David Accords. So it's an agreement between Egypt and Israel. It's a peace agreement. And dude, peace in the Middle East is a big deal. It's always a big deal, especially back then, because the Arab-Israeli conflict had been going on since Israel had been established in 1948 after World War II. So the Arab nations had refused to even acknowledge the existence of Israel. There's been, you know, a couple of wars, 4 wars exactly, and countless acts of terrorism against the nation. So in 1977, when Egypt and Israel came to the table for peace negotiations, the entire world is shocked. So at Camp David, which is one of the retreats for the president, these peace talks began. And, well, they began to pick up because peace talks between the 2 nations had started to break down. So Jimmy Carter invites them out to Camp David to help negotiate this peace settlement, and it's successful. In the Camp David Accords, Israel agrees to withdraw from the Egyptian land it had taken in the war that they had against each other in 1967. And Egypt had agreed to formally recognize Israel's right to exist as a nation. So Egypt is going to become the first Arab country to officially recognize Israel. So, I mean, this is a big deal. All right, so as far as the human rights diplomacy, Carter's going to reduce foreign aid to nations because of their human rights violations. And, you know, it's because he really feels that because we are free, we can never be indifferent to the fate of freedom elsewhere. Our moral sense dictates a clear-cut preference for those societies which share with us an abiding respect for individual human rights. So he carries this over to, you know, his foreign policy. Even the State Department's going to get involved and produce their own report card on human rights concerning 82 nations and passes legislation mandating that human rights policy be incorporated into our foreign policy. So there's going to be stuff that kind of like throws a monkey wrench in all of this, like the Iranian Revolution, the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, which is really going to turn the American people away from his policy, concerning human rights and towards a more stronger national defense. So, beefing up the military and stuff and not really acting on humanitarian measures and keeping the peace. Again, the chilling nature of the Cold War returning. So another big problem is going to be in Nicaragua and El Salvador. There's some unrest at that time. The Somoza family has ruled with an iron fist in Nicaragua, and we kind of supported them because they weren't communist. Remember, during the Cold War, we're going to support a lot of awful, awful regimes in Latin America and Asia because they're not communist. And these guys do like some big time violations of human rights, and they are really dictatorships, honestly. They are. So, the Somoza family had maintained friendly relations with the United States, but there's a violent opposition going on, and it's led by the Marxist Sandinista guerrillas. So it's a civil war that goes on. And Nicaragua is going to aid the leftist rebels in El Salvador. The U.S. is going to sponsor the anti-Sandinista Contras, who have like child soldiers and stuff. It's going to be a big mess. This is going to come to a head during Reagan's presidency. So, yeah. The Sandinistas are going to ask the U.S. for $75 million in aid. Carter is going to ask Congress for the money, but Congress is going to turn him down. And now Nicaragua asks the communists for assistance. So in El Salvador, they try to repress the anti-communist government. Well, the repressive anti-communist government murders some church people. For women, for Catholic women to be exact. And Carter is going to be like, whoa, that's a human rights violation. He wants to withhold aid, but Congress is be like, no, we need to fight some communism. Congress refuses. And there's calls to increase aid to the pro-U.S. government, no matter what atrocities they had committed. Again, we are supporting terrible regimes just because we want to fight against communism. So there's going to be a 12-year civil war that breaks out. Anti-government forces are going to support the pro-communist Nicaraguan government. So, yeah, like I said, all this mess is going to come to a head with Reagan. So Jimmy Carter is going to tell the people in his speech at Notre Dame that we should put the inordinate fear of communism behind us. So, after his speech, however, communist forces are going to begin operations in Africa, Central America, and Afghanistan. So it kind of doesn't make him look good on the world stage. It forces him to confront the fact that communism was still a menace to the peace of the world, when he himself wants to keep the peace amongst even, U.S.-Soviet relations. So he's going to call for a major military buildup to counter the Soviet military power in '79. And really his biggest challenge, though, is going to come from what happens in Iran to his foreign policy. So here's what happens. In 1979, in January, the Shah of Iran, who, the U.S. supported, is going to flee Iran. And we have a more extremist government under the Ayatollah Khomeini, who's going to establish this fundamentalist Shiite government in Iran in February, which they are more anti-American, right? So they hate America. They call America the Great Satan. They're very fundamentalist Islamic group. And what he wants to do is turn Iran into a theocracy where religion is going to rule, enforcing, harsh Quranic laws. And so by November, Iranian militants are going to seize the U.S. embassy in Tehran. They're going to take 63 Americans hostage, demand that they return the Shah of Iran, because the Shah of Iran has honestly fled to the United States, for medical treatment. So they're demanding that the United States return the Shah so they could essentially kill him. So in 1979, I mean, we're kind of humiliated. I mean, the Iranian Muslim fundamentalists under, Khomeini are taking hostages. They demand that the Shah return, and Carter's going to refuse. So Carter's going to try to plead with Khomeini, saying, hey, release the hostages. And Khomeini is like, nope, we're not going to release them until January of 1981. So, of course, that hurts Jimmy Carter's re-election bid, because the election's happening around this time. And again, Carter orders the military to attempt a rescue, and this is a disaster because 2 of our aircraft is going to collide. The mission ended before it really got off the ground, and so 8 Americans are killed in April during the hostage rescue attempt. What was going on behind the scenes, though, is what happens in the movie Argo, which is a joint effort between the Canadians and the United States intelligence to get the hostages out. And they are successful in getting out a good portion of the hostages by the ones that actually were able to flee and escape to the Canadian embassy. So, yeah, it's a good movie. Check it out, Argo. So, at the same time, the Soviets are invading Afghanistan in December of 1979, and what Jimmy Carter does is he wants to punish the USSR for their invasion of Afghanistan. So he withdraws from SALT II, stops selling them grain, declares a boycott of the Olympics that were held in Moscow in 1980. So, yeah, none of this helped to impact any of the Soviet invasion. So, here we go. Here's the 80s. We're going to cover Reagan's domestic policy right now. And we might even be able to cover Bush. Let's see how this goes. Okay. So for domestic policy, let's go ahead and start with the election. Now, remember, Jimmy Carter's image has been hurt a lot by the economic woes, foreign policy blunders like, the Iran hostage crisis, his woes with the Soviet Union, and kind of like the returning of the chilling of the Cold War. So Reagan ends up winning. And Reagan's going to become our 40th president. Of course, the hostages are released shortly after his inauguration, so people see that as more of a victory for Reagan when, in fact, it was actually started under Carter. It should have been a Carter victory, but timing, right? Timing. So what Reagan's going to do as far as domestic policy, we've got Reaganomics, or rather trickle-down economics, is supply-side economics. You guys remember this from the Great Depression, so don't worry, we're going to cover it. It's all good. So we're also going to increase defense spending because, Ronald Reagan is a war hawk, for sure. He's going to cut taxes for corporations and for the rich. He's going to reduce funding to social welfare programs because he is very anti-big government and social programs. He's going to triple the debt, however, because of all that military spending. Though there is a scandal in his presidency, the Iran-Contra scandal, but he kind of escapes prosecution because somebody falls on the sword for him, metaphorically. And he helps to end the Cold War because really we made them spend so much money during Reagan's presidency trying to keep up with our military spending. So let's go ahead and talk about the people who elected Reagan, which are the NeoConservatives and the religious right. This is where the Republican Party makes another major shift. It started to happen under Barry Goldwater, but really with the Reagan presidency is where we really see this come to a head. So liberals, of course, at this time feel that the inequalities in society can be best fixed through intervention by the federal government, kind of like what was happening under LBJ, right? He used a lot of government action to fix a lot of civil rights issues. So conservatives, of course, are backlashing against that. They believe that the role of the federal government should be small. We should have small government. Taxes should be low. The bureaucracy should shrink because they hate them some big government. So neoconservatives are going to agree with, standard conservatives about that, but they're more hardcore. They believe that there are some problems that the government cannot fix and that businesses should be deregulated so that they can flourish. Where have we done this before? Oh, the 20s. And what did that lead to? Great Depression. Oh, where did we do this before? The Gilded Age. And what did that lead to? Freaking disaster for the working classes. So, it's another instance where we don't really learn from our history. Spoiler alert, guys, there's a recession. A big one. Okay, so as far as the religious right goes, the Christian Coalition is really what they're called. They're going to want to push for more biblical style laws. So even though Jimmy Carter is a hardcore Christian, this guy is like one of the most Christian presidents ever. He's not able to win over the religious right because of his liberal policies. Instead, they're going to support Ronald Reagan and take a more conservative turn. So, speaking of Reagan and his economics, let's go ahead and go to Reaganomics, or rather supply-side economics. Some people refer to it as voodoo economics. There's trickle-down economics. There's so many names for this. So, let's go back in time to the New Deal and the Great Depression. Okay, John Maynard Keynes and his style of Keynesian economics was pretty much the dominant economic theory at the time. And remember, it best works like this. The best way to stimulate the economy is through the government spending. It kind of goes with higher taxes, but President Reagan is going to be kind of the opposite of that. He's going to subscribe to supply-side economics, which is pretty much like you basically throw the money towards the wealthy and you have it trickle down. So they believe that high taxes takes money away from the people and businesses that the economy needs. So the money that would be spent on investments in factories, equipment, research, and helping to make businesses grow isn't happening. So in order to do that, you need to cut taxes, offer tax benefits to corporations and wealthy individuals so that it could stimulate that economic growth that we want. So another part of this is going to be cutting federal spending to reduce inflation and cut unnecessary programs, like those social welfare programs we're talking about. So theoretically, this should have put more money into the economy, but in practice, it doesn't. It creates the high interest rates prevented most people from borrowing money at this time. So the policy leads to 2 years of recession because productivity declines anyways. And because Reagan is increasing in defense spending, there's going to be an even greater increase to the deficit. So it has a negative effect on the economy. Go figure, right? So this is what's going on. It does reduce inflation, though, which is weird. But yeah, economic woes are going to plague us. So here's how Reagan's tax cut works. The Economic Recovery Tax Act in 81 is going to have a 25% reduction on individual tax brackets. This is going to be phased in over 3 years. It's going to bring the top tax bracket down to 50%, which the rich are paying less in taxes. Okay, that's what it equals down to. The wealth does not trickle down, guys. So, at the same time, the Federal Reserve is going to alter the monetary policy to bring the inflation under control. And it does do that. It brought the inflation down faster and further than was expected. So it has a negative effect on the economy. There's going to be a deep recession in 1982. So later on in 1986, we got the Tax Reform Act, which is going to bring the top tax rate down again from 50% to 28%. And the corporate tax rate is reduced from 50% to 35%. So, in essence, a lot of liberals feel that the wealthy are not paying their fair share in taxes, that the burden has shifted to the lower classes and the middle classes. So, the number of tax brackets essentially is reduced, the personal exemption and standard deduction amounts are increased, and indexed for inflation. Millions of taxpayers are going to be relieved by this of any federal income tax burden. So that's why a lot of people don't really, see this as a negative thing. But again, in reality, the tax burden shifts to individuals rather than business. Shifts some of the burden from individuals to businesses, but really the big winners out of all of this are the wealthy and business. So a major effect is a downturn in the real estate market, which leads to the collapse of the savings and loan industry. So, there's some bad economic problems that are going to happen under Reagan. And of course, this is perpetuated a lot by military spending as well. Look at that increase in military spending, which in turn, since we're bringing in less tax revenue, is going to increase our federal deficit. So our national debt triples under Reagan. So really, are we doing well? Depends who you ask at this time. So, okay, when it comes to business, we had already started to deregulate business under Carter. Let's be fair. This has already started. The airline industry was deregulated under Carter. Now, advocates feel that this is going to help spark the growth of business because they no longer have to meet those high demands placed on, these regulations. Now, these demands are very costly to businesses and therefore make businesses less profitable. At least that's the theory behind it. So Jimmy Carter is going to deregulate the airline industry, which means that there are fewer controls on the fares and the routes, so they could charge pretty much what they wanted. Reagan goes a step further and deregulates the auto industry. He also gets rid of some standards for fuel efficiency and safety. He also deregulates the cable industry. So yeah, we're talking about cable industry like Time Warner and stuff. Okay, we're talking like that. So a negative effect of all of this deregulation, though, is going to concern environmental protection. Reagan is notorious for this. He often sides with businesses, claiming that sometimes profits came at the expense of a little environmental damage. Teddy Roosevelt is rolling around in his grave. Because this is two things that he freaking hates. Deregulation of big business and damaging the environment. Yeah. How far the Republican Party has come. So, let's go ahead and talk more about Reagan's domestic policy. So, there's going to be a super fund created to fund environmental cleanup projects throughout the nation. So, we do have some environmental measures, but you just heard what he had to say about business profits. So, So, the super fund was created in December of 1980 by Congress, and it enacted the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. So, the law is going to create a tax on chemical and petroleum industries, which is going to let the federal government respond to releases of potentially hazardous materials and might harm the people and the environment. So, again, we're trying to deter this from happening. Tax ends up going to a trust fund for cleaning up abandoned or uncontrolled hazardous waste sites. So, we try to, clean up environmental bad stuff that happens. Okay, as far as NASA goes, we are now with the space shuttles. We're no longer with the Apollo missions. This is our first space shuttle, the Columbia. And this orbits the Earth in 1981. So we're making some progress. However, NASA is going to face a major setback. Spoiler alert, it's coming in a couple of slides. So as far as the Supreme Court goes, Reagan is going to nominate the first female justice to the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor, in September of 1981. We have a new Chief Justice. It's no longer Berger, it is now Rehnquist. who is our Chief Justice. He steps up in 86. He's already an Associate Justice, but now he becomes Chief Justice. Scalia is also put on the court in 86, and so is Kennedy in 88. So, a major health problem that is plaguing the nation, however, is AIDS and HIV. So, HIV is a virus that causes AIDS, and we didn't know what the hell was going on like in the 70s with it. Research kind of suggests that HIV crossed over to the human population from a particular species of chimpanzee through blood contact that occurred during hunting and field dressing of animals, more than likely. So the virus exists in the United States, Haiti, and Africa since at least the late 70s. In 1979, there were rare types of pneumonia, cancer, and other illnesses being reported by doctors in LA and New York. And what they find as a commonality between them is that these conditions were not found in persons with healthy immune systems. So the CDC is going to officially name AIDS in 1982, and in 1984, they identify HIV as a virus responsible for weakening that immune system. So the AIDS epidemic is starting at this time, or rather it's increasing at this time. Now, as far as holidays, Martin Luther King Day officially becomes a holiday in 1983, and this officially acknowledges his contribution to the civil rights movement by the federal government. So it's the first federal holiday created since Memorial Day was created in 1948. All right, Reagan's a two-term president, so let's go ahead and go into term number 2 for his domestic policy. So, the election of 1984 occurs, and Reagan is largely popular. I mean, he's got inflation under control. Things are looking good on paper so far in the United States. But again, remember, we had that recession in 82. We're going to have another large recession happen in 88. Thanks to Reagan's policies. So, But anyways, NASA's setback happens during the second term. On January 28th, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger is going to explode, and the crew of the Challenger is going to perish as a result. So the explosion happened soon after takeoff. It killed all 7 crew members, including a teacher who was selected to go on the Apollo mission, social studies teacher Krista McCullough. So this is seen as a shock to the nation and a major setback to the shuttle program with NASA. So Nancy Reagan, who is our First Lady, is going to try to combat the drugs in this country by waging a war on drugs. So Nixon kind of starts this up in the 70s, the concept of waging a war against illegal drug use in 71. Reagan is going to renew these efforts, and he assigns Vice President Bush to a drug task force along with his wife, Nancy Reagan. And her thing is all just say no. That's like her campaign slogan for the war on drugs. And in 1988, the Office of National Drug Control Policy was created to, be part of the executive office of the president. So this is what they're assigned to do: the treatment, prevention, domestic law enforcement, and interdiction and international efforts concerning illegal drugs. So there's a lot of debate about the policy, what it ought to focus on. Some argue that we need to pay attention to the youth and stop drug usage, when kids are young. Others are going to be like, no, we need to halt the importation of drugs into the country and crack down on that. And then others are going to be like, no, we need to treat drug offenders and have harsher penalties for those who sell drugs. So, another domestic policy thing under Reagan is going to be the Japanese reparations that occur because of, internment. So 60,000 Japanese surviving from that time period with Japanese internment are going to receive $20,000 in reparations. So we do have time to cover Bush's domestic policy. So let's go ahead and do that. And next time we're going to talk about nothing but foreign policy with the 80s. So, all right, let's go. Okay, so in 88, we got two candidates. We've got Michael Dukakis and we have Vice President George Bush. So Vice President George Bush is largely popular because of Reagan's popularity. Here's some Valley history for you guys. The vice presidential candidate for Michael Dukakis is actually a Valley boy. It is Senator Lloyd Bentsen, who is from Mission, Wesco, Upper Valley, guys. Okay. So yeah, dude, that's the closest we got to the presidency, vice presidential candidate. So, though people really think that Benson should have probably run in his own, because I mean, look at that. There's even people casting votes for Senator Lloyd Bentsen. So yeah. Now, Bush is going to win the election because he's got some good campaign ads. We may or may not see them in class, but there's a Willie Horton ad that's really popular for him. Reagan's got like the bear in the woods kind of thing going on with one of his ads. So yeah, this presidential campaign ads are very important. Now, what's going to go on with Bush? He deals with the aftermath of Reagan's economic policies. So here comes the saving and loans crisis in the late 80s. So after the banking crisis, okay, let's get some historical context. So after the banking crisis had occurred in the 20s and early 30s, FDR is going to put some major restrictions on the banking industry because, yeah, that was one of the causes of the Great Depression. So the savings and loans industry was required by law to take short-term household savings accounts and invest that money in long-term 30-year mortgages. The mortgages had a fixed interest rate for the duration of the loan, which meant banks could only make a predetermined amount on their investment in the mortgage. And that's their only allowable source of income. So banks are also limited to loaning out money only to a 50-mile radius of their home institution, so keeping things local. And the Federal Savings and Loan Insurance Corporation insured deposits up to $40,000 to make people safe about their money. So that's kind of like a bit of the FDIC going on, but this is with the Savings and Loan Corporation. So smaller banks, more local, more regional. So you could see those are the restrictions that FDR put in place on banks because with variable interest rates, yeah, banks make more money off of mortgages, but you know, the people who have those mortgages suffer. And sometimes they cannot meet the demands of the payments. So they lose their homes, banks lose money. It's a lose-lose situation. So, yeah, we had regulated the banking industry all of this time right here. Look at that. You know, things got bad in the Great Depression here in the 30s, right? But FDR's policies are kicking in. And so we see a sharp decline in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and oh, look, deregulation in the 80s. That's the kind of spike that we see in bank failures because of turning back the clock on regulations on the savings and loan industry. Remember, Reagan's big into deregulation, and this is what happens when you deregulate the banking industry. Bank collapses galore because they don't do any of the things that kind of like safeguarded them in the first place. They're just looking at profits and being like, yeah, we want all the money. And, oh, crash. Okay. So the system really works as long as there's continual investment in the real estate industry and low inflation. But in the 70s, inflation rises. So the housing sector is going to halt. People delay buying their first home. And homeowners are not going to sell because the new mortgage rates would have been too high. So the savings and loan industry lacked income for new mortgages. And at the same time this is going on, a new type of account emerged, a money market mutual fund. Yeah, that's a typo right there. So these accounts allow investors to pull their money into accounts where there's no regulation on the interest rates. Therefore, people receive higher returns on their accounts compared to traditional savings accounts, which causes savings and loan industry to lose a lot of clients because they're switching to these money market mutual funds accounts. So really, the government responded to the deregulation of the industry in a couple of important ways to prevent complete disaster. The adjustable mortgage rates could be given to homeowners. That doesn't prevent disaster. No, that has the exact opposite. It's going to cause people to lose their homes. Never mind. This is Reagan's government we're talking about. Never mind. Okay, savings and loans were allowed to make short-term consumer loans, issue credit cards, and invest in commercial real estate. We are repeating the mistakes of the Great Depression. Okay, savings and loans were allowed to fund projects regardless of geographical proximity to bank headquarters. So essentially, we're getting rid of all of the safeguards put in place by FDR. And the FDIC raised the insurance deposits from $40,000 to $100,000. Okay, there's one good thing right there. Point number 4 is good. But seriously, though, the deregulation of the savings and loan industry allowed savings and loans to take more risks with borrowers' money, which had been done prior to the Great Depression in the 1920s, and that was a large reason for the stock market crash. So previously, savings and loan corporations and banks had been restricted to 30-year mortgages at fixed rates, which is the safest investment the bank could make. But now that we've got variable rates and all this other crazy crap, they expanded their ability to make money in various ventures. And at the same time, the federal government had their back to insure people bank accounts by, $100,000 per individual account. So people felt safe depositing their money into savings and loan corporations and in banks, regardless of the successfulness, as a business that they had, since the government basically guaranteed their money in all circumstances. So all of this deregulation, the halt of new mortgages and new income, newly allowable investments, new technology, and investment nationwide, inflation of the 70s, and competition for depositors' money created a recipe for disaster. And this is why we see this, which, again, the bank failures hit a peak in 1988 as Reagan is walking out the door and George Bush is coming in. So Bush gets blamed for this economic debacle, even though he had nothing to do with it. This is all freaking Reagan. So, yeah. Let's go back to the Great Depression one, because, you can really get the impact of it looking at this. So, I think with this right here, we will call it a day. And we will talk everything foreign policy with Reagan and Bush, and probably talk about Clinton for next class. So, hope you guys kept up with me, and I will catch you guys later. Bye, guys.